About 10 years ago or so, I started to lose my hearing and I had no idea why. And I was in a band at this time, so I figured it was probably because I didn't wear earplugs while singing, but I eventually came to realize that the problem was far worse than that. Some people have asked me if losing my hearing impacted my faith in God, and to be honest, it did. It did a lot, but we'll get to that in a bit. So I first started noticing that my hearing was changing when I realized that it wasn't as easy for me to understand what people were saying any longer. It must have been a slow process because I never realized the drastic change overnight or anything like that, so it must have been a little bit at a time. Now, even though my hearing was getting worse, it took me a while to realize just how serious my condition was. It eventually got to a point where I wasn't able to make out a lot of what people were saying most of the time, and the only way that I was able to follow conversations was because I could understand a few words in the sentences, and I would be able to kind of fill in the blanks when people were talking. But eventually, hearing just a few words seemed to stop serving me as well, because conversations were still getting harder for me to follow, and when I couldn't make out what people were saying, I would just be saying, huh? But after having them repeat themselves a couple of times and still not being able to make it out, I felt bad for having to repeat themselves over and over again. The more times that I had people repeat themselves, the more I could tell that people were getting annoyed at having to do so, and the worse I started to feel about it. Even just considering the amount of punchlines, the jokes that I ruined by having people repeat the punchline a few times was enough to make me start to feel like I was becoming more of a burden to be around rather than a joy. I started to feel out of place more and more and started to get more uncomfortable as time went on. Over time, I started developing social anxiety. Just the thought of feeling so awkward and uncomfortable around people all of the time and making other people feel uncomfortable for having to be around me and trying to communicate with me made me start to fear social situations. And it wasn't just the social situations that I feared. My biggest fear was not being able to achieve my dreams that I had in life simply because of my hearing loss. Now, at this point in life, the only two things that I really cared about in life were music and women. And I believed in God at this point, but to keep it real, most of my time and focus and even my self-value and my self-worth and identity was dependent on creating music and meeting women. Those were basically the only two things I thought about at the time, and I genuinely felt like life wouldn't be worth living if I didn't become a successful music artist. I felt like I was made and put on earth to do music. But as my hearing started to fade, both doing music and meeting women seemed to be threatened by this loss of hearing. When I thought about losing out on those things, I vowed that hearing aids just weren't an option. It wasn't like I could cover them up with long hair or something like that. So I told myself that I won't be rocking no hearing aids until I'm at least 40 years old. Now, fast forward to a few years later after I met my wife and we had our first son. Now, when my son was born, my dad came in from out of town to meet his grandson for the first time. But when my dad was there, my son would cry. I wouldn't even be able to hear my son's screams because they were so high pitched. But when my dad noticed that I couldn't hear him screaming, then he said, "Son, I'm taking you to go get a hearing test." And so he took me to a small kiosk inside of a Sam's Club, and I sat around in the booth waiting for the hearing test to start. But what I didn't realize is that the test had already started. I just couldn't hear any of the noises. And the hearing doctor was like, "You mean you can't hear any of that?" And I couldn't. It was at that point that the doctor told me that my hearing is the worst that he's ever heard in someone my age, and he begged me to just go get help. He said he didn't care if I saw him, he didn't care who I saw, just go somewhere because not treating my hearing could lead to dementia and all kinds of other issues. So he gave me a bunch of pamphlets that cited how studies showed that your hearing health is important because it's connected to a lot of other things besides just hearing. So after talking to him and taking some time to look over and read the pamphlets, after a few days, I started to come to accept the seriousness of my hearing loss. I finally came to terms with the fact that I did actually need to get help, and I finally decided to just bite the bullet and go ahead and go and get some hearing aids. Now, don't get me wrong, I still dreaded the idea, but I thought about how I couldn't even hear my newborn son's voice well and how I would never get that time back. And I also thought about how much intimacy I was losing with Kara from not being able to hear her and have long conversations with her because those long conversations became too exhausting. I reasoned that hearing aids wouldn't be so bad as long as I only wore them at home, and I told myself that there was still hope for me to pursue music. So I gave in and I went to a hearing specialist, and I was prepared to get some hearing aids. But after they tested my hearing, they gave me some really bad news. They told me that I only had 15% hearing in one ear and 10% left in the other ear. They said I lost the ability to hear high and mid frequencies and that I was starting to lose some of the low frequencies as well. By the way, without high and mid frequencies, you can't hear consonants consonants, which makes speech really difficult to understand. And they told me that after about 7 years of not hearing those consonants, you'll start to lose the ability to speak them in your own speech, and you can never get that ability back. And to make matters worse, they had no idea what caused it. They said that there's still a lot that we don't know about hearing loss, and the fact that the hearing loss doesn't run in my family, and that I didn't seem to contract some virus of some sort that triggered it, it left them into dark as to why I lost my hearing at such a young age. But if all of this wasn't enough to take in, they dropped even worse news on me. They told me that because of how significant my hearing loss was, hearing aids wouldn't be able to help me. They said that the only option that I had at this point was to get a cochlear implant. Up until this point, I had no idea what a cochlear implant was. I never even heard of the name before. All I knew was that they told me that basically it was a hearing device that had an external and an internal component, and so it required for me to get surgery. They told me that after surgery, I would have a long rehabilitation period where I would have to learn how to hear all over again. Now, all I could think about at this time was how there had to be some other way. There had to be an alternative. And I thought that maybe they were just trying to sell me on this $250,000 surgery in order to make some more money or something like that. But after going to get more opinions and getting told the exact same thing, I realized that I had no choice. I had to go ahead and go through with the surgery. So I set up the appointment and I went forth with the surgery, and that was the beginning of an all-time low point for me. The surgery itself wasn't too bad because I woke up feeling pretty good and I didn't feel too much pain. But the next day after the surgery, that's when things took a sharp turn for the worse. I experienced the worst vertigo you can imagine. Even with my eyes closed laying down, the room was still spinning inside of my head and making me feel extreme and consistent nausea for days. I literally couldn't do anything for a couple of days. I couldn't even get up to go to the bathroom. And this is probably TMI, but I had to use a cup and roll over to pee in it because I just couldn't stand up. So anyways, I had to wait for about a month after the surgery before they can actually turn the cochlear implant on. And as I waited to have it turned on, I really didn't even know what to expect. I had seen some videos before of some people that had it activated, and when they got theirs turned on, they were instantly able to hear their spouses and their parents' voices for the first time, and it's a super emotional moment for everyone involved. But I also read about some horror stories where nothing happened. The implants never seemed to help their hearing, and in fact, it actually made their hearing worse, since the surgery typically makes you lose the rest of the natural hearing that you had in the ear that you get the surgery on. So for a small percentage of people, the implants never worked. When I was on my way to the appointment, I remember thinking to myself, I said, surely my luck can't be that bad. There's no way that I'm going to end up being part of that smaller percentage, right? Well, when it was finally time to turn the implant on, to be honest, at that point, I really did have some high hopes, and I was excited to hear the world that I was missing for so long. I could tell that the audiologists who were in the same room with me also had high hopes for me. So after everything was all set up, they asked me if I was ready, and I said yes. And one of them said, okay, here we go. So they connected the device to my head, and then they started looking at me with a look of suspense and anticipation in their eyes. And when I didn't say anything for a few seconds, they asked me, so, what do you hear? But the only reason I was able to make out what they said, it was the same reason that I was able to hear what they said before, and that was because I could read their lips pretty well. So after it turned on, I still couldn't hear them any better, and I tried not to be too disappointed about it. But soon after that, I realized that I could hear noises through the implant, but they were just confusing. It's so hard to explain. I could hear noises, but I couldn't understand any of them. I started to realize that everything that I couldn't hear before was coming through the implant, but they sounded like beeps and ticks, and they sounded super mechanical. The world kind of sounded like one of those old school dial-up modems. If I were to make an S noise by going tss, in my ear, it would sound like beep. It was the weirdest thing ever. I realized that I just couldn't wrap my mind around those noises either. They all sounded disconnected from me in a weird way. Like I knew that they were there and I could hear them, but I couldn't grip them. I couldn't focus on them, if that makes sense. So I would constantly be asking my wife, what was that? And it would be things like a car blinker or a spoon hitting the plate or a microwave beep, the air conditioning rumbling in the background, and so on. But none of those noises sounded anything like they were supposed to. Any noise that had some high or mid frequencies in them, they would come into my ear device in different noises, and they'd all sound one-dimensional because there was no distance between any of those noises, and I also couldn't hear where those noises were coming from. Now, as time went on, my hearing was supposed to be getting better, but it just wasn't. After a month or so of doing the exercises, I started to think that maybe this just isn't going to work for me. I started thinking that maybe I was just going to be another one of those horror stories of people who it just didn't work out for. And then I started thinking about how I probably made one of the worst decisions ever, because now I'd be in a worse position than I was before the surgery, since now I lost a little bit of hearing that I had left before the surgery. But I tried not to jump to any conclusions, and I waited for another month. Same thing. And again, I waited again for another month. And this was actually an all-time low point for me in the process, because I came to not only realize that I probably just made the worst decision by going forward with this surgery, which I didn't even want to do in the first place, but it started to dawn on me that all of my dreams were starting to fade away, and I was never going to achieve my dream of being a music artist. It just wasn't going to happen for me. There was one day in particular, I remember thinking this, and I just felt so defeated and just drained from the entire process. At this point, I felt ready to just give up. And I was trying to listen to a podcast at the time, and as usual, the voices came in sounding like garbled mechanical noises. But then I remember hearing the podcast, and I was able to make out a bit of tone underneath those weird robotic noises that replaced human speech for me. What I heard, it sounded like a voice underneath all of the mechanical stuff. When I realized that I could hear a little bit of a voice, it oddly breathed new life into me, and it made me so happy that it was a really emotional moment for me, and I started to tear up. I remember I was right at the breaking point when I saw just that little glimmer of hope, and that little bit of hope gave me the motivation to just continue to keep moving. As time went on, I could hear even more of the tone underneath those mechanical sounds, until the tone became more dominant above those weird robot noises. It took about a year after my surgery that the world finally started to sound reasonably normal to me. It's been about 5 years since the surgery now, and today I hear pretty well. And here's the implant. Not sure if you can see, but this part hooks around the ear, and this part attaches to my skull with a magnet. And then as soon as it attaches, it turns on so I can start hearing. Now, there's still a couple little drawbacks of hearing, like when I have it on, I'm way louder to myself than I am in real life. So I take it off when I record videos, so that way I can make sure to talk loud enough, because I used to keep it on when I recorded and it would sound like I'm whispering. And to this day, I'm still not able to hear how far something is, and I can't hear which direction that things are going to be coming from. And they told me that I'm not going to be able to ever get that ability back, but I can still have conversations with people, and I can hear the world in a way that sounds normal to me. I say normal to me because what sounds normal to me probably isn't what sounds normal to you, since I've gotten used to the noises that probably aren't how things really sound. But still, I just feel blessed to be able to hear today. Now, one question I got over and over from people was how losing my hearing has impacted my faith, since people knew that I was really passionate about music and stuff like that. And to be honest, losing my hearing did impact my faith a lot, and in 3 major ways. First, when people ask me if I still kept my faith after losing my hearing, I think about what the assumption is behind that question. The assumption is something like, if you're a Christian and you believe that God exists and you start living your life as a Christian, then things are going to get good for you. But you see, I didn't grow up in a church going home, and I didn't really have a lot of interactions with Christians in my life at a young age. So when I read the Bible for the first time myself, I realized that the most important figures in the Bible didn't necessarily have peaceful and problem-free lives after they came to believe. If anything, most, or if not all of them, had some really hard times. So I didn't have this expectation that everything would be all rainbows and butterflies after I became a Christian. So realizing that helped me to think a little bit deeper about pain and suffering from a biblical perspective, and this also helped me to be able to help other people see that they shouldn't lose their faith simply because some bad things have happened in their lives. In Christianity, we're to expect suffering because we're not promised to have good lives or anything like that. The only thing that we're promised in the scriptures after becoming Christians is that we're going to have trials and tribulations. Secondly, I learned so much about myself, my personal idols, and what I really need in this life, because until this happened, I got so much of my personal identity and value and significance in so many other things besides God. In this process, I realized just how much we don't even realize how much of our self-worth and value we get from these other things until those things are starting to be taken from us. Starting to lose those things and realizing your dependence on them is incredibly humbling. And lastly, since I wasn't able to communicate with people that much at the time and I was out of work for over a year, I spent most of that time reading and studying and also debating atheists on Facebook. And in one of the Facebook debate groups that I was in, I met a Christian from Australia who told me that he thought I should start a YouTube channel. I hardly even watched any YouTube at that time, but he said that he was going to buy me a camera to get me started and for me to just give it a shot and try it. And so I did, and that's how I ended up starting this channel. So I don't know why I lost my hearing, and I probably will never know in this life either. But what I do know is that either God allowed it to happen to me in order to humble me and bring me closer to Him so that way He could use me in order to spread His message, or He used what was meant for evil against me for the good and for His glory. So either way, I'm just thankful for the experience, and I'm incredibly humbled that God would actually use someone like me. So that's my story. Thank you guys so much for sticking around with me to the end. And if someone that you know didn't stick around until the end, could you just do me a favor and ask them?
What do you mean?